I've always wondered what it really means to walk by faith. Not the kind of faith people talk about casually, but the kind that asks you to leave everything familiar behind. When I think about that kind of faith, my mind goes back to one man, Abraham. His journey didn't start with a map, a promise of comfort, or a guarantee of success. It started with a voice, a quiet, commanding voice that simply said, "Go." Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that everything you've built, everything you've known, is no longer where you're meant to stay. No destination revealed, no timeline, just a direction, away from what's comfortable and toward what's unknown. I picture Abraham standing there looking at the land he'd grown up in, surrounded by people who knew his name, traditions that shaped his life, and routines that made sense. Then suddenly the call came, not to improve what he had, but to leave it. I wonder how many conversations he had with himself before taking that first step. Did he hesitate? Did he question if he heard correctly? Or did something deep inside him whisper, "This is the moment everything changes"? Walking by faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who calls, even when the path is still hidden. When I think about that first step Abraham took, I realize how terrifying it must have been. He was leaving behind his safety net, his home, his relatives, everything he knew. The future was blurry, but the calling was clear, and I can't help but see how much this speaks to us today. We all reach points in life where staying in the same place feels safe, but deep down we know it isn't where we're meant to remain. Maybe it's a job, maybe it's a toxic relationship, maybe it's a fear we've clung to for too long. The truth is, faith always demands movement. It calls us forward when we'd rather stay still. Abraham didn't know what lay ahead, but he trusted the one who asked him to move. That trust was bigger than the fear of the unknown. And isn't that the same battle we face? Every great change begins with a single step. And every step of faith is both a risk and a promise. Abraham walked into the unknown, but he wasn't walking alone. That makes me think, how often do we forget that in our own journeys too? The more I think about Abraham, the more I realize his story isn't about a man who had it all figured out. It's about someone willing to trust despite uncertainty. And that trust led him to promises bigger than he could ever imagine. God told him his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Can you imagine standing under a desert sky, seeing millions of glittering lights, and being told, "This is your future"? It's almost impossible to comprehend. But Abraham believed, even though everything around him said it was impossible. He and Sarah were old, well past the years of childbearing. Every fact said it couldn't happen. Yet, in the middle of impossibility, faith dared to believe. And that's the beauty of walking with God. His promises don't depend on our limitations. Sometimes what looks impossible to us is just the beginning of His plan. Abraham's story reminds me that faith isn't blind. It sees differently. It doesn't deny the obstacles. It simply chooses to trust a greater reality beyond them. Of course, Abraham's journey wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, he doubted, and sometimes he tried to take matters into his own hands. He and Sarah decided to hurry God's plan, and the result brought pain and conflict. And isn't that just like us? How many times have we grown impatient when answers didn't come fast enough? How many times have we tried to fix things our own way, only to make the situation worse? But even in failure, Abraham's story shines with hope. God didn't give up on him. The promise wasn't canceled because of his mistakes. Instead, God continued to lead, to remind, to restore. That's what inspires me most. Walking by faith isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. It's about getting up after falling, choosing again to trust, and believing that God's grace is bigger than our failures. Abraham wasn't a flawless hero, he was human. And that makes his journey even more relatable. And then there's the long waiting. Faith isn't just about taking the first step. It's about taking the next step and the next, even when years pass without answers. Abraham and Sarah waited decades for the promise of a child. Can you imagine the emotional roller coaster? Hope rising with each year, then disappointment when nothing changed. Yet in that waiting, faith was being refined. Because walking by faith doesn't mean everything happens instantly. It means trusting the timing of God, even when it stretches beyond what seems reasonable. In our own lives, waiting is often the hardest part. We live in a world of instant gratification, but faith calls us to patience. It calls us to trust that delays are not denials, and that the waiting itself shapes us for what's coming. Abraham's decades of waiting remind me that faith isn't proven in moments of excitement, but in years of endurance. And then, the impossible happened. Sarah, who had laughed at the idea of bearing a child in her old age, held her baby boy in her arms. Isaac, whose very name means laughter, was the living reminder that God keeps his promises. I imagine the joy in their home, the sound of laughter filling the air, the tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. After so many years of uncertainty, the promise was tangible, real, alive. And isn't that just how God works? He takes our disbelief, our doubts, and turns them into testimonies. Isaac's birth wasn't just about Abraham and Sarah. It was about showing generations to come that faith in God is never wasted. Whenever I think about Isaac's name, I'm reminded that joy comes after seasons of sorrow, and promises do come to pass, even if they take a lifetime. But the journey didn't end there. One of the most heart-wrenching parts of Abraham's story is the moment God asked him to sacrifice Isaac. The very promise he had waited for, the miracle child, was now placed on the altar. I can't imagine the weight of that test. Walking 3 days to Mount Moriah, each step heavier than the last, carrying not just wood, but the burden of unexplainable obedience. And yet Abraham trusted. He believed that somehow, some way, God would provide. That kind of faith humbles me. It challenges me to ask, do I trust God with the things most precious to me? Walking by faith means surrendering even the blessings, knowing the giver is greater than the gift. And in the end, God did provide, a ram caught in the thicket. Isaac lived, and Abraham's faith was proven. It wasn't about losing Isaac. It was about revealing a faith that held nothing back. When I reflect on Abraham's journey, I see a story that mirrors our own struggles. We are called to leave comfort zones, to face unknowns, to wait in seasons of silence, to endure disappointments, and to surrender what we treasure most. And through it all, faith is the thread that carries us. Walking by faith isn't about a perfect path. It's about a perfect God leading imperfect people. It's about discovering that even when we don't understand the plan, we can trust the one who holds the future. Abraham's life is proof that ordinary people can live extraordinary stories when they choose faith over fear. And so, I look at my own journey, and maybe you look at yours, and we realize we're not so different from Abraham. The details may change, but the invitation is the same. Will you walk by faith? Will you step into the unknown, trust through the waiting, and surrender what you hold dear? It won't always be easy, but it will always be worth it. Abraham's story isn't just history. It's a living reminder that faith is still the path to promises, that trust is still stronger than fear, and that God is still faithful. As I close my eyes and picture Abraham gazing at the stars, I realize that same invitation is for us today. Walk by faith. Step into the unknown. Trust that every step, no matter how uncertain, is leading you towards something greater than you can imagine.